There's a very specific moment that repeats itself in many lives, and it is easy to misread if you only look at it from the outside. For a long time, you want something. You think about it. Move toward it. Imagine it. Work for it. Maybe it is love. Maybe it is peace. Maybe it is success, visibility, freedom, a healthier life, a more honest life, a life that actually feels like yours. For months or years, you tell yourself that this is what you want. You feel the lack of it. You suffer because it is not here yet. You imagine how different life would feel if it finally arrived. And then something starts changing. The door begins to open. Not all the way, perhaps, but enough. An opportunity appears. A relationship deepens. A new path becomes possible. A clearer version of yourself begins to emerge. Something real starts approaching the very thing you thought you wanted. And that is when the strangest part begins. You start pulling back. Not always dramatically. Not in ways that are obvious even to you at first. Sometimes it looks like hesitation. Sometimes like delay. Sometimes like sudden confusion. Overthinking, emotional numbness, loss of interest, or a subtle urge to create distance from the very thing you were longing for. This is what makes the experience so difficult to understand. If you wanted it so much, why does its arrival suddenly make you uneasy? Why does the moment that you feel like relief begin to feel strangely dangerous? Why do you find yourself resisting what you've been asking life for? At first, you may try to explain it in practical terms. Maybe the timing is wrong. Maybe you are tired. Maybe you need more clarity. Maybe you are just being careful. And sometimes those things are partly true. But if the pattern keeps repeating, another possibility begins to emerge. You are not only afraid of failure. You may be afraid of what happens when your desire stops being fantasy and starts becoming reality. That is a very different fear. Fantasy is safe in a certain way. Even painful longing can be psychologically safe because it keeps you in motion without forcing transformation. You can want something for years without having to become the version of yourself who actually lives inside it. Desire remains intact. Hope remains intact. The future remains open. The self remains essentially the same because what you want still exists at a distance. But once the thing begins to arrive, distance collapses. And with that collapse comes a new demand. Now, you do not only have to want it, you have to inhabit it. That is where many people begin to retreat. You may see this in relationships very clearly. You long for real intimacy, real consistency, real emotional availability. You are tired of confusion, tired of mixed signals, tired of all the unstable dynamics that keep you half attached and half starving. You tell yourself you want something healthier. Then someone genuinely chooses you, not ambiguously, not conditionally. They show up clearly. They are present, open, available, grounded, and rather than simply feeling grateful, something inside you begins to contract. You become more cautious, more distant, more suspicious, more restless. The connection is no longer abstract. It is real, and because it is real, it asks more your identity than longing ever did. The same thing can happen with work, purpose, or creative life. You want to be seen. You want to create. You want the life that feels more alive and more true. But when the possibility of visibility becomes concrete, when the work is ready enough to leave the private world and enter public reality, suddenly you feel like pulling away. You delay, second guess, minimize, distract yourself. Tell yourself you will return to it later. From the outside, it may look like inconsistency. From the inside, it often feels more like an invisible threshold you do not know how to cross. You are not retreating because you do not care. Sometimes you are retreating because you care so much that the reality of becoming begins to feel more dangerous than the pain of remaining where you are. This is what people rarely admit. Staying limited can feel safer than expanding, not because limitation is pleasant, because it is familiar, and familiar pain often feels less frightening than unfamiliar possibility. You may begin to notice how subtle this is. The closer something good gets, the more noise appears in your mind. Questions that were not there before, doubts that feel suddenly urgent, flaws you had not noticed earlier, a rise in emotional confusion right at the moment clarity would actually require action. This is not accidental. It is part of the pattern. Something in the psyche is reacting to proximity. As long as the desired life remains theoretical, you can organize yourself around wanting it. But when it gets close enough to change you, another force appears. One that says, perhaps not in words but in feeling, wait, not yet. Step back. This is too much. You may recognize this especially in the way your energy shifts near breakthroughs. There is often a rise in anxiety when things start going well, a sudden heaviness when life becomes lighter, a strange urge to sabotage structure just as it is beginning to hold. People often misread this as self-destruction in a shallow sense, but the pattern is usually more intimate than that. It is not just destruction, it is defense, a defense against transformation, because transformation is not only exciting, it is expensive, not financially, not socially in the obvious sense. Psychologically, it costs you the old version of yourself. That cost is easy to underestimate. If you have spent years being the person who longs, struggles, waits, overcomes, anticipates, or survives, then the arrival of what you want does not simply change your circumstances. It changes the structure of your identity. Who are you if the thing finally happens? Who are you if life gets better? Who are you if love stays? Who are you if success becomes real? Who are you if your potential is no longer an idea, but a responsibility? These questions are not theoretical. The psyche feels them, and often it reacts before the conscious mind has language for what is happening. This is why the retreat can feel almost irrational. One part of you is deeply sincere in its desire. Another part begins acting as if the desire itself has become threatening. You may even notice that the more real the opportunity becomes, the more old patterns return, old coping behaviors, old distractions, old emotional loops, almost as if the psyche reaches backward toward the familiar precisely when the future begins opening forward. This can feel frustrating in ways that are difficult to explain, because on one level, you know exactly what you are doing. You can see yourself withdrawing. You can see yourself delaying. You can see yourself pulling away from what you claim to want. And yet seeing the pattern does not immediately dissolve it. In some cases, it may even make you feel ashamed. Why do I keep doing this? Why do I ruin the good things? Why do I get this close and then disappear? But shame, here, often obscures more than it reveals. Because the deeper truth is not that you are broken in some simple way. The deeper truth is that part of you still experiences growth as danger. That part may not speak loudly. It may not appear in clear thoughts, but it shows itself in timing, in hesitation, in self-interruption, in the strange emotional turbulence that rises exactly when life begins becoming more possible. This is especially hard because the surface story often says the opposite. You think your suffering comes from not having what you want, but in these moments, you start realizing that having it may require more from you than wanting it ever did. Wanting keeps you in desire. Receiving moves you into embodiment, and embodiment changes everything. Because once something is real, you cannot relate to it from the safe distance of fantasy anymore. You have to step into it. You have to become visible inside it. You have to let the old structures of self begin to loosen. That is often where fear lives, not in the good thing itself, but in the self who would have to emerge if the good thing were fully allowed. That is why the closer life gets to opening, the more urgent the inner conflict can become. You are not only facing a new circumstance, you are facing a new version of yourself. And until that is understood, you may keep interpreting the retreat in simpler ways. Laziness, confusion, bad timing, loss of interest. But underneath all those explanations, a more serious question is beginning to form. Not, why do I sabotage what I want? But, what in me still experiences becoming more fully alive as a threat? That is the real threshold. Because once you reach that question honestly, you are no longer only dealing with behavior. You are approaching the hidden structure of identity that has made limitation feel safer than expansion. And that is where the real work starts. What begins to reveal itself beneath this pattern is that self-sabotage is often not really about the thing you want. It is about what that thing would require from your identity. That distinction matters more than it first appears. Because if you only look at the surface, the pattern makes little sense. You want love, then pull away when love becomes available. You want peace, then become restless when life gets calmer. You want success, then delay, numb out, or create chaos right before something opens. The conscious mind sees contradiction and asks the obvious question: why would I reject the very thing I say I want? Carl Jung would approach that question differently. He would not begin with contradiction. He would begin with structure. What is the ego organized around? What role has limitation been playing in the psyche? What old arrangement is being threatened by the arrival of something genuinely new? These are deeper questions, and they lead to a much more serious understanding. The ego, in Jung's psychology, is the center of conscious identity. It holds together your sense of I. It organizes memory, preference, self-image, and continuity. It allows you to move through life with a stable enough sense of who you are. But the ego does not only seek pleasure, it seeks coherence. That is crucial. The ego will often prefer familiar suffering over unfamiliar expansion if suffering is what is giving your identity shape. This is why growth can feel more threatening than pain. Pain may hurt, but it is known. It confirms old roles. It supports old stories. It keeps the structure recognizable. Growth is different. Growth destabilizes the arrangement. It asks the ego to relate to life from a place it has not yet fully inhabited, and that can feel like danger even when the external situation is good. Jung understood that the psyche develops through adaptation. You become someone in response to conditions. If life required endurance, you became enduring. If it required self-protection, you became defended. If it required invisibility, you learned how to hide. If it required proving, striving, compensating, or surviving, those functions gradually form part of the ego's organization. Over time, the adaptation stops feeling like adaptation. It feels like identity. That is where the problem deepens. Because once the old adaptation hardens into identity, anything that threatens it feels like a threat to the self itself. Imagine, for example, someone whose inner life has been built around striving. Their worth is tied to working harder, proving more, overcoming limitations, chasing something just beyond reach. This structure may be exhausting, but it gives shape. It tells them who they are. Now imagine that real success begins to arrive. Not fantasy success, not future success, but actual opening, visibility, recognition, stability, opportunity. From the outside, this should feel like reward, but inwardly, it can feel disorienting. Why? Because the ego is no longer only being asked to achieve. It is being asked to exist without the same compensatory struggle. If I am no longer chasing, who am I? If I am no longer proving, where does my energy go? If life becomes easier here, what happens to the version of me who knew how to live through difficulty? That is the hidden crisis, not success itself. The loss of familiar identity organized around pursuit. Jung would likely describe this as one expression of individuation pressure. The psyche is trying to move toward greater wholeness, but the ego is still invested in an older and narrower way of being. The new life asks for expansion. The old ego answers with defense. This is why self-sabotage often intensifies near thresholds. The threshold is not just external. It is internal. It marks the point where the old self can no longer remain intact if the new possibility is fully accepted. This is also where the shadow becomes important. People often imagine the shadow only as darkness, destructiveness, jealousy, rage, selfishness, or pain. Jung certainly included those things. But the shadow contains whatever the conscious personality is not integrated. That includes possibility, talent, desire, power, beauty, capacity, authority, joy, visibility. The unlived positive life can remain shadowed just as much as a denied negative life. This matters enormously here, because if your greater life remains in shadow, then when it begins approaching reality, it does not feel simple. It feels uncanny, too large, too exposing, too demanding. Too unlike the smaller identity the ego has learned to manage. You may consciously want more life, but unconsciously you may still be organized around being less than your full potential. And when the shadow of potential begins coming close enough to be lived, the psyche reacts. Not because it is evil, because it is unintegrated. Someone whose shadow holds strength may feel weak in the face of empowerment. Someone whose shadow holds visibility may feel anxious the moment recognition becomes real. Someone whose shadow holds love may feel unsafe when love actually stays. Someone whose shadow holds abundance may feel morally troubled or destabilized when life begins offering more. This is one reason the breakthrough phase is so emotionally complex. The external event may be good, but the internal response is not purely gratitude. It is often a mixture of longing, fear, attraction, guilt, confusion, and retreat. Jung would not find this contradictory at all. He would say that a new psychic content is pressing toward consciousness, but the ego has not yet built a stable relationship to it. That instability can trigger all sorts of defenses: delay, sudden doubt, overanalysis, withdrawal, distraction, emotional deadness, loss of desire at the exact moment desire becomes actionable. These defenses are not random. They are protective. Protective of what? Of the old organization of self. There is also a deeper layer involving the persona. The persona is the social face, the adaptation through which you are recognized with others. Many people have built a persona around limitation without fully realizing it. Not limitation as a conscious value, but as an emotional role. The struggler, the misunderstood one, the overcomer, the one with unrealized potential, the one who almost got there, the one who carries pain well, the one who is deep because they are burdened. These personae can become strangely stabilizing, even noble. They give the ego shape and often generate recognition from others. Now imagine that your life begins genuinely changing. The old persona cannot hold in the same way. If love becomes real, you can no longer only be the one who longs. If success becomes real, you can no longer only be the one who almost becomes. If peace becomes real, you can no longer only be the one who survives chaos. That means the old persona begins to die, and all psychic death, even beneficial psychic death, is experienced by the ego as threat. This is where many people make a serious mistake. They assume the anxiety means the new life is wrong. But often the anxiety simply means the old self is losing its monopoly. Jung knew that transformation often feels like death before it feels like life. Not literal death, but death of identification. Death of the narrow arrangement through which the ego has known itself. If you do not understand that, you will keep misreading the fear as a message to retreat. In reality, the fear may be saying, you are approaching a real change, and the old self is no longer enough to manage it. That is very different. It also explains why progress can feel heavier than fantasy. Fantasy asks nothing immediate of you. You can imagine a bigger life while remaining the same person internally. Real progress does not allow that. It introduces responsibility, embodiment, form, consequence, a new relationship to power. Jung paid close attention to power, especially inner power. He knew many people are less afraid of pain than of their own capacity. Why? Because capacity changes hierarchy within the psyche. It changes what you can no longer excuse, postpone, or remain unconscious about. If your potential becomes real, you can no longer hide behind unrealized possibility. You must become accountable to what is in you. That accountability can feel more frightening than failure. Failure lets the old self stay intact. Expansion demands revision. There may also be guilt here. Guilt about outgrowing old surroundings, old loyalties, old identities. If becoming more alive means becoming less available to certain patterns, then part of the psyche may interpret growth as betrayal, not because growth is wrong, but because the older emotional world was organized around different rules. Jung would likely see this as part of the tension between the individual and the collective. Individuation always creates some degree of separation from collective expectations, collective identities, collective agreements about who you are allowed to be. The old psyche may resist not only because growth is unknown, but because growth threatens belonging. So the sabotage appears, not as a moral failing, as a defense of continuity. The psyche says, better to remain where I know how to exist than to enter a life that would ask me to reorganize at every level. This is why the problem is not solved by motivational language alone. You cannot simply shame yourself into expansion. The real task is to understand what the old self is defending, what the new life is asking, and how to survive the transition without unconsciously returning to limitation as your only stable home. That is what Section 3 will have to address. Because once you see that self-sabotage is often the ego defending itself against transformation, the question changes. It is no longer, why am I ruining good things? It becomes, what old identity is panicking because life is asking me to become larger than the version of myself it knows how to survive as. That is the real heart of the struggle. A different kind of movement begins when you stop interpreting the fear as a command to retreat. That is the crucial shift. Because for a long time, the pattern may have felt automatic. Life starts opening and the psyche pulls back. A good thing approaches, and suddenly confusion rises. Opportunity appears, and you find yourself tired, distracted, doubtful, strangely unmotivated, or emotionally unavailable to the very thing you thought you wanted. If you do not understand what is happening, you naturally obey the reaction. You assume the anxiety means something is off. You assume the hesitation means you're not ready. You assume the retreat means the desire was never real. But once you begin seeing the deeper structure, another possibility appears. The fear may not be telling you the new life is wrong. It may be revealing how unprepared the old self is to inhabit it. That difference matters. Because if the old self is the one panicking, then the answer is not to hand your future back to that older arrangement every time it feels threatened. The answer is to remain with the threshold long enough for a new relationship to possibility to form. This is where real psychological work begins. Not in force. Not in pretending fear is not there. Not in spiritual language about alignment that only hides avoidance in more flattering words. The real work is much more human than that. You feel the contraction, and you stay. You notice the sudden urge to pull away from the person who is actually showing up, from the work that is actually becoming real, from the peace that is actually beginning to settle, from the opportunity that would actually change the shape of your life. And instead of immediately obeying the old instinct, you pause. That pause is not passive. It is the beginning of transformation, because until now, the old pattern has its speed on its side. It reacts before deeper consciousness has a chance to enter the room. The psyche senses expansion, the ego feels destabilized, and defense begins. Delay, doubt, numbness, distraction, emotional turbulence, whatever the usual form may be, starts moving almost automatically. When you pause, even briefly, something changes. You become aware of the sequence. And awareness breaks inevitability. This is not yet freedom in the full sense, but it is the first crack in the old machinery. Jung's psychology always points toward this kind of movement. He did not believe unconscious patterns were overcome by moral effort alone. He believed they had to be made conscious enough that the person could begin relating to them rather than being fully possessed by them. So the practical beginning here is simple, though not easy. You learn to notice what rises in you when life gets closer, not the abstract future. Closer, when the message comes in, when the offer becomes concrete, when the relationship becomes real, when the work is finally good enough to leave the private world, when the door opens. That is the moment to watch most closely. What happens in your body? What happens to your thinking? Do you suddenly become unclear in ways that feel strangely familiar? Do you start focusing on minor flaws with disproportionate intensity? Do you feel a drop in emotional energy right when movement would matter most? Do you begin longing for distance from the very thing you've been asking for? These responses are not random. They are the old self trying to restore its territory. And once you recognize that, the next step becomes possible. You begin asking a different question. Not, how do I get rid of this fear? But, what is this fear protecting in me? That is a more precise question. Maybe it is protecting an identity built around longing rather than receiving. Maybe it is protecting an image of yourself as potential rather than embodiment. Maybe it is protecting you from visibility, from responsibility, from the grief of leaving older versions of yourself behind. Maybe it is protecting your attachment to being the one who almost arrives, the one who could have, the one who still has not had to fully live at the scale of what is possible. These possibilities are not flattering, but they're often true in some form. And truth is what makes integration possible. Because once you can see what the old self is trying to preserve, you stop treating sabotage as meaningless. You stop reducing it to weakness or laziness. You begin to understand it as a defense of continuity. The old self would rather repeat what it knows and cross into a life it cannot yet organize around. That insight softens the shame. It does not remove responsibility. It removes simplification. And without simplification, you can finally work with the real issue. The real issue is not that you do not want a good thing. The real issue is that wanting it from afar and living it from within are psychologically different experiences. Living it requires embodiment. Embodiment is the part people often underestimate. To embody a new life means letting it affect your posture, your choices, your rhythms, your relationships, your expectations, your sense of self. It means you no longer relate to the desired thing as fantasy, but as environment. And environment changes identity. This is why the body often reacts before the mind fully understands what is happening. The body senses the threshold. It knows that if you say yes, if you stay, if you receive, if you allow this, then something old will not be able to continue in the same way. And because of that, the body may produce urgency, confusion, tiredness, panic, agitation, or the need to run. This is where patience becomes a serious psychological discipline, not the patience of passivity. The patience of not collapsing the moment too quickly. You do not need to solve your whole life when fear rises. You need to stay near the opening long enough for another internal possibility to form. That may mean doing less than your mind wants and more than your fear wants. You may not make the gigantic leap, but you do not disappear either. You reply to the message instead of withdrawing for 3 days. You let the person remain close instead of manufacturing distance. You submit the work even while feeling unfinished. You stay in the calm instead of generating fresh chaos. You say yes to the opportunity, even though some part of you still feels unprepared. These acts may appear small. Psychically, they are immense, because every time you move with the opening instead of against it, the old equation weakens. Life opening does not automatically equal danger. Growth does not automatically equal disintegration. Receiving does not automatically equal loss of self. This is how the psyche learns a new structure, not by being told to trust, by surviving new contact. Jung would likely describe this as the ego coming into a different relationship with the self. The self, in his work, is the larger organizing center of the psyche, the totality that exceeds the ego's narrower self-image. The ego often experiences the self as both attractive and threatening, because the self asks for greater wholeness than the ego can comfortably manage. That is what is happening at these thresholds. More of your life wants to come into form than the old ego is prepared to contain. So the task is not to destroy the ego. It is to let it stretch, to let it discover that it can survive wider life than it previously believed. The stretching often feels like instability at first. You may feel less certain, not more. More exposed, not less. That does not mean you are going backward. It may mean the old certainty was built on limitation. Real expansion often feels less controlled before it becomes more coherent. There is also grief here, and it must be allowed, because as you stay with the opening, you may realize that the old self cannot come with you unchanged. The one who lived on anticipation, on emotional drama, on striving, on proving, on surviving, on wanting from afar, may begin to loosen. That can feel like relief, yes, but also loss. You may miss the old intensity, even while knowing it was costly. You may miss the identity of the seeker, even as you become the receiver. This is a real grief. And if you do not let it move through you, you may keep recreating the old pattern just to feel familiar again. So part of stay with the opening means mourning what the opening makes obsolete, not worshiping the old self, not despising it either, honoring that it carried you to the threshold, and allowing it to stop running the whole life. That is an act of maturation. Eventually, something subtle but profound begins to shift. You no longer experience every opening as a test you are about to fail. You begin to feel that some good things can actually stay. That peace does not have to be interrupted. That love does not have to be chased to feel real. That success does not have to remain just beyond your reach in order to preserve your identity. That potential does not have to stay potential in order to be safe. This is not the disappearance of fear. It is the emergence of a deeper willingness. A willingness to let life alter you. A willingness to let the new self begin forming in contact with what once frightened you. And once that willingness exists, even imperfectly, self-sabotage begins losing its authority. Not because you become invulnerable, because you stop treating old fear as a final truth about what you're allowed to become. That is the real movement of integration here. Not merely stop sabotaging, something far deeper. Remain present long enough that the life trying to open no longer has to fight so hard against the part of you that still thinks limitation is home. And when that happens, the threshold stops being only a site of panic. It starts becoming what it always was. The doorway between the life you imagined and the life you are finally beginning to inhabit. What makes this pattern so painful is that it hides inside desire. You look at your life and think the problem is simple. You want something. You move toward it. Then somehow, again and again, you pull back. So the surface conclusion feels obvious. I must be afraid of failure. I must not really want it. I must be sabotaging myself for no reason. But if you have followed this process honestly, you can see now that the truth is more complicated than that. The fear was never only about losing. Very often it was about becoming. That is the part most people do not understand. Failure is familiar to many psyches. Limitation is familiar. Delay is familiar. Struggle is familiar. Even pain, as difficult as it is, can become part of the emotional architecture of identity. It gives shape. It gives narrative. It gives the ego a role to play. But growth asks for something entirely different. Growth asks the old self to loosen. It asks longing to become embodiment. It asks fantasy to become responsibility. It asks the person who has spent years imagining another life to begin actually living inside it. And that can feel far more dangerous than people expect. Carl Jung would have understood this immediately. He knew that the psyche does not resist only what is bad for it. It often resists what is new, what is wider, what is truer. Whenever those things threaten the old arrangement of selfhood, the ego wants continuity. It wants a recognizable form. It wants to remain who it has been, even while asking life to become larger. But life does not work that way forever. At some point, if what you want is real, it begins demanding that you become real in relation to it. Not only hopeful, not only longing, not only preparing. Real. And that is where the threshold appears. The threshold where the old identity says, this is too much. The threshold where limitation suddenly feels safer than expansion. The threshold where the good thing becomes frightening not because it is wrong, but because it would require you to stop being a version of yourself that only knows how to survive at a smaller scale. That is the real heartbreak of self-sabotage. Not simply that you lose good things, but that part of you still does not trust life enough to let it change you. This is why the pattern must be approached with seriousness and compassion at the same time. Seriousness, because it has consequences. It shapes relationships, work, timing, love, opportunity, the actual form of your life. Compassion, because the part of you that pulls back is not random. It is protecting an older structure that once felt necessary. It learned that pain was safer than vulnerability, that longing was safer than receiving, that trying was safer than fully arriving. You do not undo that overnight, but you can begin refusing to let that old fear become the final authority. That is the real movement forward, not waiting until fear disappears, not waiting until you feel completely ready, not waiting until the old self gives full permission to outgrow it. Sometimes growth begins when you simply stop taking the panic as proof that you should retreat. Before we close, ask yourself something very directly. What good thing in your life keeps reaching you that you keep stepping back from at the last moment? Love? Visibility? Peace? Opportunity? A truer version of yourself? And once you name that, ask the harder question. What version of me would have to die if I finally let this in? Stay with that, because the answer will show you what the sabotage is really protecting. If this resonates, write in the comments one area of life where you notice yourself pulling back right when things start opening. Not to judge yourself, to see the threshold clearly. And if you know someone who keeps getting close to what they want, only to withdraw, delay, or destroy the moment before it becomes real, share this video with them. Because sometimes the deepest fear is not that life will fail you. It is that life might finally work, and you will have become someone new enough to live inside it.